All right. So the next step is to talk about how these different hormone subtypes, um, especially in terms of water soluble versus lipid soluble, interact with their target cells. So the first one to consider are the water soluble hormones. So the biggest challenge that water soluble hormones have in terms of acting on target cells is that they can't cross the plasma membrane. Right? They're water soluble, they can't diffuse across the plasma membrane. So these hormones act on receptors that are found on the plasma membrane. Okay? So this little red structure is our hormone. This structure is the receptor, and it's sitting on the plasma membrane. Okay? So it binds to the receptor on the plasma membrane, and it's going to do one of two things. Okay? The first thing it could do, and this is not drawn on this slide, but the first thing it could do is it could bind to the receptor, and that could cause the opening or the closing of an ion channel. Okay? And then that opening or closing of the ion channel, let's say it opens the ion channel, allows for ions to cross the membrane. That changes membrane potential, makes it either depolarized or hyperpolarized, and that change in membrane potential brings about the physiological response. The second thing that the hormone, the membrane hormone, membrane receptor of a hormone can do is act through a second messenger system. So the hormone is the first messenger, but since it can't cross the membrane, it has to act through an intracellular second messenger. Okay. So these receptors that trigger second messenger systems are often under a category of receptors that we call G protein coupled receptors. Now, G proteins are proteins located within the plasma membrane that use GDP as opposed to ATP, right? GTP as their form of energy. Okay, so it takes GTP, forms GDP plus P, liberates some energy, and then it acts through something called adenyl cyclase or diacylglycerol and creates an intracellular change. Okay? So the intracellular change is the second messenger. So two possible second messenger systems include a substance called cyclic AMP, and another possible second messenger is basically calcium, so a rise in calcium. Cyclic AMP, when cyclic AMP is produced as a result of hormone binding to a receptor, the levels of cyclic AMP go up, right? And then cyclic AMP activates an enzyme called a protein kinase. And protein kinase enzymes phosphorylate proteins, meaning that they add a phosphate group to a protein. Now, protein phosphorylation is basically just a way to activate or inactivate a protein, oftentimes an enzyme, right? And then it's that activated or inactivated protein that brings about the cell's response. So I'll give you an example. So imagine that this hormone up here is insulin. Okay. So insulin binds to its insulin receptor. It acts through a second messenger, let's say it's cyclic AMP, and that causes, that activates a protein kinase. And it phosphorylates an enzyme to turn on the enzyme. Now, insulin, when it binds to cells, receptors on cells, it's going to increase the activity. It's going to phosphorylate the enzyme necessary to synthesize what we call glycogen. And glycogen is how glucose is stored inside of cells. So since insulin is going to allow glucose to enter this cell, that's its primary job, what it is also going to do is turn on proteins necessary to take that glucose and store it in the form of glycogen. Okay? And storage of glycogen ends up being the cell response that we're talking about. Another variation on this second messenger system is when a hormone acts through a rise in intracellular calcium. Okay. Now, this rise in intracellular calcium can directly cause the cell's response. So let's say that rise in calcium is causing the exocytosis of vesicles of other hormone, right? And the release of that hormone ends up being the cell's response. Okay? So calcium itself can end up bringing about the cell's response, but you can also end up activating, again, a kinase causing phosphorylation of a protein, and that being the cell's response. Okay? So don't get too bogged down in this, okay? So the most important thing to keep in mind when it comes to this concept of a second messenger is that the hormone is the first messenger, the cyclic AMP or intracellular calcium are the two second messenger systems, okay? And that cyclic AMP will end up phosphorylating a protein which turns it on or off, and that's what brings about the cell response. Okay? And calcium will either independently bring about the cell's response or phosphorylate the protein, turn it on or off, and that'll do it. Okay? So those are the key things to keep in mind. Now, for lipid-soluble hormones, they can cross the plasma membrane. Okay, so let's say this little green guy here with an H was a lipid-soluble hormone. This guy has no problem just diffusing across the membrane because he's lipid-soluble. So he doesn't have to bind to a surface receptor. So many of these, or the vast majority of these lipid-soluble hormones, their receptors are actually found inside the cell, in fact, inside the nucleus. They have what we call nuclear receptors. So this structure here with the R is the nuclear receptor, and this is the hormone binding to it. So if you notice, this receptor is actually sitting on a region of DNA, and it's going to be sitting on a very particular region along DNA. It's going to be sitting on what we call the promoter region of a very specific gene. The promoter region is the region of a gene, it's the initial portion of a gene that controls the expression of the gene, basically whether that gene gets transcribed or does not get transcribed. So the hormone binds to that receptor and it, for example, triggers the transcription of the gene. That produces messenger RNA that travels out of the nucleus, and that messenger RNA is translated, and it causes the synthesis of new protein. And that new protein is the physiological response. Okay? So, for example, thyroid hormone, and we'll talk more about this in class. Thyroid hormone, we kind of know that thyroid hormone has a lot to do with metabolism, right? One of the ways that it affects the metabolism of a cell is that thyroid hormone binds to a receptor that sits on the promoter region of the gene that codes for our sodium-potassium ATP pumps. Okay. So when thyroid hormone binds to the receptor, it increases the production of these sodium-potassium pumps. Right? That means that the cell is going to consume more ATP and therefore needs to produce more ATP, and so it increases cellular metabolism. Okay. So the general rule is is that these water-soluble hormones act through second messenger systems and plasma membrane receptors, and these lipid-soluble hormones act by binding to nuclear receptors and control gene expression and the production of protein. Okay. Now, one additional thing to remember, however, is that for many lipid hormones, in addition to having a nuclear receptor, they may also have a what we call a cytoplasmic receptor, meaning that they could have a receptor sitting within the plasma membrane. And if the hormone binds to that receptor, it's going to potentially trigger a second messenger system that brings about a response. Okay. So lipid hormones tend to have both nuclear receptors and also cytoplasmic receptors. But the cytoplasmic receptors are not going to control gene expression. They're going to do some of the same things that the second messenger systems in the previous slide did. Okay, phosphorylate proteins, right? Increase intracellular calcium, that sort of thing. Okay. Now, lipid-soluble hormones. So we talked about lipid-soluble hormones. In order to travel in the bloodstream, has to be bound to plasma proteins. So hormones bind to plasma proteins. Many hormones bind to plasma proteins. All lipid-soluble hormones must be bound to plasma proteins in order to travel in the bloodstream. Okay? All lipid-soluble hormones. Now, there's really two types of plasma proteins that bind to hormones. We have a very generic binding in the form of binding to albumin. Okay? So albumin is a plasma protein that will bind to lipid-soluble hormones, any lipid-soluble hormones, and that relationship is going to be a very low affinity kind of binding, and it only serves the purpose of transport. Okay? So when hormones bind to albumin in circulation, it only serves the purpose of transport, and it's usually because that hormone is lipid soluble. On the other hand, we also have hormone-specific binding proteins. Okay? Now, there are hormones like thyroid hormones, steroid hormones, IGFs, which stand for insulin-like growth factors, and growth hormones. Hormones like this, so thyroid hormones are lipid-soluble, steroid hormones are lipid-soluble. These guys are actually water-soluble. But all of these hormones have particular binding proteins. So there's a thyroid binding protein, there are very specific steroid binding proteins, growth hormone binding proteins, IGF binding proteins. And that relationship between the particular binding proteins and the hormone is a high affinity bond. Okay? Now, or at least definitely higher than albumin. Now, the purpose of hormone binding in this case is more than just transport. Okay? Certainly, if it's lipid soluble, it serves the purpose of transport. But it also serves another purpose. And it serves the purpose of providing a reservoir in the circulatory system for that hormone, and that minimizes the minute-to-minute fluctuations of that hormone. Okay? So for all of these hormones that I mentioned, they bind to their particular binding protein in order to produce this sort of stable plasma concentration. And this reservoir of hormone. It's really almost a very creative way of storing the hormone in circulation. Okay? And it also, by binding to these proteins, it extends the half-life of these hormones. So they get removed from circulation at a much slower rate than they would if they didn't have these binding proteins. So specific binding proteins are there and very, very important for hormones that bring about effects that need to be sustained. So thyroid hormones bring about sort of overall metabolic changes. Steroid hormones often do similar things. Growth hormone and IGF is going to be essential for maintenance of body structure and growth. Okay? So these sorts of hormones, we don't want their levels to be going up and down all the time. So by having these binding proteins in circulation, we create this reservoir, we prevent minute-to-minute fluctuations, and we extend the half-life. Okay? And it allows for these hormones whose actions are more long-term to be more stable in circulation.